Hi, my name is Sarah and I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is August 23rd, 2013. I have a sponsor and I sponsor other women. I choose to work the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. So my story starts back in a small town in South Central Florida. I was the oldest of 4 children, and I was raised in a household where there was no alcohol, no drinking. My father was a minister, and my mother was a praise and worship leader. So I grew up in the church, and for the most part, for the first 9 years of my life, it was very sheltered. It was a very loving home. There was never any kind of physical abuse or anything like that. No drug use, no trafficking, no nothing. And so it was a good life. And then when I was 9, my father decided to leave home. And when he left home, there created a whole bunch of abandonment issues. I was always the child, starting at like the age of 3, that was a social butterfly. I loved everybody. I was friends with everybody. I was constantly singing and dancing and having a great time. And then at 9 years old, I started to kind of become more isolated. I spent a lot of time by myself because I missed my father. And then in 5th grade, my mother remarried, and that's when I got introduced to drugs. My stepfather was in and out of rehabs, would rob us constantly, and go to the dope house and would come home after days. And that kind of opened my eyes to like a different type of world. Never really felt comfortable in my home, never really felt safe. And a couple months after he moved in with us is when the sexual abuse started to happen. And at the time, because I was so isolated, I didn't know how to tell anybody. And I was so fearful that if I said something that he would start to do it to my little sister. So I just kept quiet. And it took me a couple years of this going on before I actually came clean to my mother. And when I did, I was called a liar, and I really hated myself. And I didn't feel like I could talk to anybody, and I didn't feel like anybody understood me. So I immediately got into therapy, thankfully, because of my grandmother. But unfortunately, I hated who I was. I didn't know who I was. I was completely lost. I had lost my childhood faith. And I ended up starting running with the wrong crowd at like 14 years old. By 15, I was addicted to meth, and I would leave home and just go on binges, come home when I wanted to. At this point, my mother was a single mother of 4, so there wasn't a whole lot of rules or, there were rules, so I just broke them. And so I was at 15, after I had gone on one of my final binges, my mother refused to bring me home because I was a bad influence for my brothers and sisters, so I got turned over to the state. And when I got turned over to the state, I was only there for a couple weeks before I was able to manipulate her into bringing me home, that things were going to be different. So I came home and I continued using, and at this point I was drinking and I was partying every day. At 17, I decided that I was going to leave home. And I basically told my mother if she didn't let me leave, that I was going to emancipate myself. So she let me leave, because being in a small town, you worry about your reputation. So I left, and I moved into a house where there was like a bunch of parties. I got really strung out between... Apologies. I got really strung out on drugs, on pills in particular. And by the time I turned 21, I ended up in jail. My mother would not come and get me, wanted nothing to do with me, told me to figure it out, that this was tough love. And I ended up pleading out and did an 18-month program. And if I didn't complete the program, then I was going to have to do a year and a half in prison. And so I completed the program. But the problem with the program was that every single day on color code, they were testing me for drugs and not alcohol. So my alcoholism skyrocketed at that moment. And I was in bars every single night, and I would work 3 jobs in order to afford my addiction. And this continued this way until I turned 23. And as soon as I got off probation, I thought a geographic relocation was probably my best bet. So I moved to Jacksonville, Florida, and with my best friend. And within about a year, she died in a DUI accident from drinking way too much when we got off work. And that hit me pretty hard to where I found myself in a bottle every day. And I was drinking at work. I was drinking after work. I would wake up in the morning and I would smoke whatever I could get my hands on. And at 25, I was at work and we had just hired a new cook. And I had absolutely no idea about the program because when I got turned over to the state and even while I was on probation, nobody introduced me to another way of living. And I remember being at work and there was like an after party and I invited this girl who had just started working for us. I was like, you want to come out and have a few drinks? And she's like, I can't. And I was like, why? And she's like, alcohol makes me break out. And I was like, break out in what, like hives? And she's like, no, in handcuffs. And I thought it was the funniest thing. And I never understood. And she's like, I'm allergic to alcohol. And I was like, okay. So we continued like our friendship. I would watch her at parties. She would never drink, never understood it. And I remember one day I had opened up to her about, you know, my life and like the things that I experienced and my drug use and all that. And she said that I would be a good candidate for Al-Anon. She never once pressed me to go to AA, never once told me that maybe I have a problem. But because of what I had experienced in life, the Al-Anon would be a good option. So I started attending Al-Anon meetings, and at this clubhouse, there was an Al-Anon room on the top floor, an AA room on the bottom floor, and she'd come with me to Al-Anon meetings. I would go to her with like AA meetings. And I remember sitting at one of my very first AA meetings, and it was a speaker meeting, and the woman was in her like 60s. And she started to tell her story, and I started to be able to identify with a lot of the things that she felt like internally that I had never spoke about. A lot of the experiences that she had gone through, I had also gone through. And she started talking about like this hope and like this life of being happy, joyous, and free that she had today that I had never experienced. And if I had, I didn't remember what that was like. And like the mustard seed of the program and a different way of living got planted that day. I did not get sober that day. I continued to go to AA meetings for the next 10 months and go to Al-Anon meetings for the next 10 months. But I wasn't ready to admit that I had a problem yet. So fast forward a couple years and I get a promotion in Pinellas County. And so I moved down to Pinellas County and they put me in a hotel for training for about 4 months. And during that time, because I didn't know anybody, I spent all of my time not at work in the hotel room with a bottle. My days off, I would be at the pool with a bottle. And then I remember going to babysit my nieces. And my niece, one of them was pretty much a newborn. She was only a couple weeks old. And I had hidden at this point my alcoholism. I wasn't, using drugs regularly, but I was smoking weed every day. And my mom had no idea. I hid it from her very well. I mainly just continued to make money and I would support my family and send them money. So they never thought I had an issue. And I remember when I was babysitting, I had to wait until my mother went to sleep. And as soon as she went to sleep, I was chugging a bottle. And I remember trying to see whether or not my niece was breathing as a newborn, and I couldn't feel her breathing and I couldn't see her breathing because I was so drunk. And that was on the 18th of August. And from the 18th of August until the morning of the 23rd, every single day I woke up looking in the mirror and not realizing who I was. And the more that I realized that I didn't know who I was, the more that I started to hate who I was. to the point where I wasn't looking in the mirror by the fifth day, to where I was driving every day to work for 4 days, and I was contemplating just running my car directly into a wall because I could not figure out how to live life the way that I had been all these years and be happy. I wasn't happy. I didn't know who I was, and I was completely lost. And I remember going home on the 22nd and drinking myself into a complete blackout. And my roommate looked at me and said, I think that you need AA. I think that you need to go and try this. And the more that she talked about AA, the more that I drank, because I was like, nope, not for me. And then the next morning I woke up and there was like a light bulb. Like, I can't even explain it, but there was like this feeling of like, you don't have to live like this anymore. Like, you don't have to do this anymore. And so I went to work and I told my boss what was going on. And I was like, I need your support because I'm going to try to get sober, but I don't know what that's going to look like. And he's like, I've got your back. And I said, okay. And I went to my first AA meeting that night, and I walked into a room where there was about, I don't know, like 40 to 50 women, all ages. Most of them were older, and I sat down in a chair and they said, do we have any newcomers? And I raised my hand and I said, my name's Sarah, I'm an alcoholic. And I was shaking so bad and crying so hard because it was the first time that not only did I admit it to myself, but I admitted it to an entire room of people that I was an alcoholic, that I did have a problem. And they welcomed me with open arms. Women were coming up to me after the meeting, giving me phone numbers. There was this one woman in particular that walked directly up to me with this big old smile and these big old eyes, and she was so happy, and I was miserable. And she's like, you don't have to live this way anymore. You never have to feel this again. And I said, okay, I'm willing. Like, what do I need to do? And she's like, I want you to call me tomorrow. And I said, okay. And so I didn't drink that day. I called her the next day, and I was shook and cried in every single meeting for the next 2 weeks. I could barely hold my freaking coffee cup. And, but I did. I called her every single day. And by the sixth day, I was like, I was told that I need a sponsor. Will you be my sponsor? She's like, I already have been. And I was like, perfect. So what do we do now? And she's like, we're going to start working the steps. So I did. I worked the steps. Every single suggestion that was given to me, I took it. AA doesn't work for everybody. If you look at my track record, I did way more drugs than I ever drank. But at the end of the day, alcohol is what brought me to my knees to the point of surrender. The AA program is something that I was able to be spiritually fed from, and was the meat and potatoes that I needed in order to stay sober every single day. And I worked the steps. I have changed sponsors a couple times just because sometimes you just outgrow your sponsor, but you find somebody that has what you want. And, today I get to work a program and live by principles that I never even knew existed. Today I work, with people that are trying to get sober too. And I remember what it was like when they were struggling, and I'm like, you don't have to do this anymore. This way of life is something that I never thought was possible. Not saying that it does not have trials. There's a lot that I've had to walk through in sobriety. The death of friends, they talk about how like we're going to have to step over bodies if we're going to, and keep on this journey, like keep on walking, keep doing this every single day. And, I've had broken relationships. I've had to restart over and live my life and change everything about it multiple times. But the one thing that was always my constant was a relationship with my higher power, and was constantly being in contact with people in the rooms, people that were able to walk this life before me, people that had these experiences before me. A couple years ago, I lost a baby, and there was nothing that I could have done any differently, and that was hard. That was extremely hard because I have wanted to be a mother for as long as I can remember. And, but the women in the rooms showed up. I remember being a year and a half sober and thinking all of a sudden I've got it and I don't need AA anymore. And that does not work. Very quickly, within a couple months, I was in a bar ordering a drink, and thankfully I had a friend there that kept me from doing it, that reminded me, like, you're about to give everything up. everything that you worked hard for, you're about to give up. Are you willing to do that? And I said, no, absolutely not. And I went back. So, you know, it's a way of living. It's a choice. They talk about in literature all the time that the key to this is the willingness to do whatever it takes, but it starts with a desire. You have to have a desire first, and then the willingness. And as long as I continue to have the desire and the willingness to do something different, then I get to live this way of life every single day. And for that, I am ever grateful.